So today I'm chairing and I live in Cambridge, so that's where I'm joining you from. And I'll briefly introduce our other two speakers who are joining us from Tokyo and Bristol. So Professor Aya Abe is director of the Research Center for Child and Adolescent Poverty, which she herself established in 2015 at Tokyo Metropolitan University. And prior to that, she spent 16 years at the National Institute of Population and Social Security Research, which is a government research institute. And her book, Child Poverty, Re-examining Japan's Inequality, which came out in 2008, was very important in putting the issue of child poverty in Japan on the map. And our second speaker will be Professor David Gordon. He is director of the Bristol Poverty Institute and the Townsend Centre for International Poverty Research at the University of Bristol. And he has published widely on issues of social and distributional justice, poverty, child poverty, and so on and so forth. Right, so let's just look at the timeline here. It should be about 20 minutes for each presentation. We'll probably run on a bit longer than 1 o'clock with the Q&A, depending how things go. So over to our first speaker, Professor Aya Abe.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aya Abe, and I am a professor of social policy at Tokyo Metropolitan University, which is a public university created by the Metropolitan Government of Tokyo. And today, I thank Daiwa Anglo-Japan Foundation for hosting this seminar. It is a very, very honor for me to be here because poverty research has been a really, I mean, the UK is really the where all the poverty researchers all over the world really look up to. And I'm really honored to be with Professor David Gordon, whom I have learned so much, almost all of what I'm doing the research on from his work. So without further ado, let me just talk a little bit about the poverty issues in Japan. And I will share the slide now. Okay, can you see the slide now? And the last time I did put this on a slideshow, my microphone got muted. So I'm gonna do this like this. Many of you might think that Japan does not really have poverty. And that seems to be the impression that many people share, including the Japanese people living in Japan. But let me just show you some basic statistics first. This is using the OECD definition of poverty, which is 50% of median equivalized household income. And it's showing the percentage of all the people and the people in the three different age categories. And so we're using the same definition for UK and Japan and comparing the two countries. And you can see, if I look at all ages, UK poverty rate is 11.7 versus Japan's poverty rate is 15.4, which is quite high. And this is partly because Japan is much more aged society than the UK. And the poverty rate tends to be higher for elderly compared to the young people, the working age people. But even if, with that under consideration, if we look at the poverty rate for each age categories, you can see that Japan has higher poverty rate for all age categories, even for children. And the difference is the largest among the elderly, where the 20% of Japan's elderly above 65 years old is considered to be in poverty, as opposed to 14.9% for the UK. And you might think, oh, maybe this must be a new thing, because I know that Japan used to be a really equal society. And I think Japan was depicted as a very equal society in many of the literatures, including some of the very famous ones, like the Spritz level by, and so forth. So, but if you look at some numbers, this is the child poverty rate from 2004 to 2018. And for UK, I had the rate for every year. In Japan, we only have it for every 3 years. But except for 2006, which is about the same, you can say that Japan's poverty rate has always been higher than the UK. And I think, can you see my cursor, around here? This is where I think the Tony Blair declared the war on child poverty, and the UK's child poverty started to decline quite rapidly. And even but this time that at least in the UK, the child poverty is acknowledged as one of the big social issues. But in Japan, even in 2000, even into like 2009 or so, we had no knowledge that we had child poverty problem. And let me just go back a little bit in time. And I know that David is going back much more historically in his slide, but I'm going to go through 1960s. This myth that Japan is a very equal society came around 1960s and 1970s. And we had very rapid economic growth after the war. And in 1965, the ministry stopped measuring the number of households with low standard of living, which is the same thing as poverty, and saying that everyone's living standard is going up compared to right after the war. And so that poverty as we know it has ended in the 1960s. That was the official understanding. And in 1970s, one of the word became to the, in Japan, every year we use the word that was most used in that year. and one of the ones that was chosen was Ichioku Sochuru, which means 100 million all middle class. 100 million was the population of Japan at the time. And so this is saying that, we are a country where everyone is the middle class. It is no poor class and no rich class, And this actually came from the 1975 national survey, where the government asked the people, which class do you think you belong to? And the choices were upper middle, lower middle, and lower. So even randomly, 60% of the people would say middle class, but more than 90 people picked one of the middle three. So that this was the basis evidence that everyone thought that everyone was a middle class. But this is more than 50 years ago. In the 1990s, we started to see the first signs of poverty, and like we started to see homeless persons on the street, like this person. He was more than 80 years old, and he was living on the street. And I actually took this picture. But even then, and government denied that we had any poverty problems, because the homeless people must be doing that because they like living outside, kind of thing, or they are too drunk, or they're too lazy. They're the special people, and it's not something that's for that happens to normal people. But but if you look at the poverty rate, actually, even in the 1980s, the poverty rate for Japan is being quite high, 12% for all persons and 10.9% for children. And it has been going up quite steadily from 1980s to 2012. So you can see that the poverty is not really a new problem in Japan. And what the policy change happened around 2008. And this is when Lehman shock happened. And in 2009, we had the first government change in 50 years. And the Democratic Party won the election. And the other ones who were saying that we should do something about poverty. So at the time, we all the poverty researchers like us were expecting that maybe we will really go forward in poverty reduction schemes in government programs. But what happened was that right after they took over, there was the earthquake, and there was such a huge relief effort needed in Tohoku area in 2011 that all the poverty programs stopped right then. Because we in Japan, and everyone was just looking at Tohoku area and then the victims of the earthquake and tsunami. And the people who were poor, for other reasons, were kind of like forgotten at that time. And government changed again, so that we now have the Liberal Democrats again in the House. And then, but still, there was some progress that we had. 2013 law to promote policies against child poverty was enacted. This was the first law that actually has the word poverty in its articles, and it mandates the government to take some action against child poverty. But it doesn't, the law does not say what it has to do. It just says it has to take some action. So it was all up to the government to decide what is needed. And, you know, of course, they had the budgetary concerns and stuff like that. So they could also always decide what to do, you know, what to do or what not to do. And also, the law was so specific that it only promotes child policies for policies for child poverty, and not for other kind of poverty, like families, grown up, the parents, and also the single persons and elderly. And because even at this point, Japanese government and Japanese society were kind of like still hooked on, if you are poor and you are, you know, adult, then it must be your fault, kind of thing. But you know, for children, we have to do something. That was the rationale. So even after the law, our policy is still kind of backward compared to the UK. And I have tried to put up some comparisons, but UK system is so complicated that maybe David can explain to me more in detail later. The population covered by public assistance, and in here, for UK, I put universal credit income support for lone parents and income support general, and it was 1.3%, which is about the same as Japan. And the population covered by public assistance is 1.1% for Japan. But more than half of this 1.1% is actually elderly, because we do not have the pension system that guarantees the minimum pension. So actually, this is becoming more like a pension than a real public assistance. A population covered by housing benefit is 5.9% for UK. This might be quite might be changed by now. This is quite an odd number. And for Japan, we don't really have any housing benefit, except those on public assistance, they can get some assistance. Share of public housing is 70% for UK as opposed to 3% in Japan. The child benefit, as in, because child poverty is a big issue, was for UK, it's about £84 for the first child per month. But for us in Japan, it's about £33 for children above 3 years old. So what is happening is that the government's role in reducing the poverty rate is very limited in Japan. And here I'm showing the poverty rate before and after tax and transfers. And I mean, you can see that, you know, the same thing is that for working age people, I mean, UK and Japan both are not as doing as much as for the elderly. But if you look at the working age, you can see that the before tax poverty rate is actually higher for the UK than in Japan. But after tax, tax and transfer, poverty rate is higher for Japan. And for the elderly, our poverty rate before tax for the elderly is very high, nearly 70%. And 49% of that is reduced, but still it is only up to 20%. But this 20, I mean, here you might think that the government is doing a lot, at least for the elderly poverty. But what is happening is that really, this is a really gendered issue. And if you look at the poverty rate by sex and age groups, you can see that for elderly, the poverty rate for women is much, much higher than poverty rate for men, because our social security system, social pension system is really dependent on the one breadwinner type of family structure. so that if a woman loses her husband or a woman is single to begin with, her pension rate is not very high. And this also means that we have very uneven poverty risk among Japanese families, what we call abnormal. And I really shouldn't use this word, but in a Japanese context, it really is used this way. Those people who do not follow the regular family life cycle, where you get married in your 20s or 30s and then have children and live with your child, the first child, after you become old. Anyone who defies this kind of life cycle or life course, they have much higher risk of poverty. For example, if you look at the working age person, the single person meaning does not mean non-married person. It means that person living alone. So mostly non-married people have much higher poverty rate than people who have partners. Well, people who have partners and children. But if you are one parent family, then your poverty rate is much higher. For elderly, the same. Again, the single person has a very, very high poverty rate. And for single women, elderly women, the poverty rate is as high as 46%. And the one parent with the children also much higher poverty rate. So it is a very gender and as well as family dependent kind of situation. But it's a bit different if you look at the material deprivation. And here I'm not going to go in too much, but the EU, I know the UK is no longer in EU, but UK, I think, is still participating in EU Silk, which is a survey for living standards for EU countries. And they use this material deprivation index, which Professor Gordon has developed. And I calculated the poverty material deprivation rate for Japan, and to surprise, it was much lower than I expected. And Japan was, for example, 5.6% as opposed to 12.7% for the UK. And this is for the working age, and for elderly, even less, 1.2% for Japan and 4.9% for the elderly. So people may have a lot of material things, but the items here are kind of like TV, washing machine, and a car, and heating to keep home adequately warm, and these kind of things Japanese people tend to have, but still they do not have an income level. They do not have enough income to really support themselves. To show some of the things that they're having difficulties with. This is shown in the percentage of all households that has difficulties paying these utility bills. And it has been going down somewhat, but still about 3% of all households have difficulties paying electricity bills, gas, water bills, phone, and housing loan, and rent and housing rent, and stuff like that. So in terms of income, there are still a lot of people who have problems. And even for children, families with the children, we found that 1% of the children living in Osaka Prefecture are living in a household where they had electricity or gas or water suspended because they could not pay the utility bill. So to sum up, yeah, I have 4 more minutes. Characteristic of poverty in Japan, more than anything, is family structure determines the living standard of individual, especially for women. And then that is really not good news right now, because right now 1/10 of women never get married, and one in 5 men do not get married all throughout their life in Japan. Childlessness is becoming very, very big in terms of share. So there are more people who just do not have any families, for men and for women as well. And this, I did not really show much of a slides, but the problem in Japan is not unemployment. You probably know that unemployment rate in Japan is very, very low compared to most of the OECD countries. But it is the working poor, the people who are working full-time but cannot make ends meet. And social protection is very, very strict, and places very stringent means this. That means that we have very low recipient rate. And however, I think the manifestations of poverty is quite different between UK and Japan. For example, just to show you some statistics, this is neonatal mortality rate. And Japan is the best among OECD countries, and as compared to the UK, which is right here. But if you look at suicide rate of adolescents aged 15 to 19, and there is the link between poverty and suicide, and especially related to bullying in school, Japan is much worse than the UK. So maybe how the poor people actually fare in their lives and what kind of difficulties they have might be different from the UK and Japan. And this is some of the things I like to discuss later on. Thank you very much. And I end my slides here.
Thank you very much. And thank you for such an excellent talk, Professor Abe. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I'd like to thank everyone for coming to this webinar, and I'd like to thank the Daiwa Foundation for giving me the honor to speak to such a knowledgeable and important audience. I'm going to share my screen and try to use some automated subtitles. Okay, I'm going to talk about child poverty and anti-poverty policies in the UK. Let me just try this bar away. So, just to put the situation in its international and national context, if we look at what has happened in the neoliberal era since the 1980s, over the 35-year period between 1980 and 2016, what we find is that despite all the economic growth that has occurred in North America and Western Europe, a large proportion of that growth has been captured by the richest 1% of society. So between 1980 and 2016, 28% of all economic growth in North America and Western Europe was captured by the richest 1%, whereas only 9% of that economic growth was captured by the poorest half of the population in those rich societies. So we have a situation today where the richest 1% of the population in the world owns more wealth than the whole of the rest of humanity, about 51–52%. According to analysis by the UK Parliament, if current trends continue, then by 2030, the richest 1% will own close to 2/3 of the wealth of humanity. So the world is becoming very unequal. And this is particularly true in the UK. So this shows the Gini coefficient, the level of inequality in UK society from 1937 to 2012. And what we found is with the introduction of the welfare state, the levels of inequality fell until the end of the 1970s. And then with the introduction of neoliberal policies, inequality has begun to grow. And you can see on this graph here, this line here, which is the income share of the richest 5% in the UK, which follows the inequality measure. And so academics have concluded that it's reasonable to argue that income inequality in the UK today is at least as high as it was before the Second World War, before the introduction of the welfare state. Now, what we know from the history of pandemics across many societies, this graph looks at the effects of pandemics on the income of the richest and poorest 1%, 10% and 20% of the 21st century pandemics. That looks at SARS, H1N1, MERS, Ebola, Zika. And what we find is that the incomes of the top 10% tend to rise slightly during the pandemic, but then after the pandemic, relative to the rest of society, they tend to rise quite rapidly. About 5 years after the pandemic, they're about 6% higher. By contrast, the incomes of those at the bottom of society tend to fall by a few percent during the pandemic or epidemic, and then they continue to fall after the pandemic has passed and fall by about 10 or 12% on average, slightly less for the top and bottom, 12%. So pandemics impact the most vulnerable, and they tend, if nothing is done, to lead to greater inequality, widening of the gap, and greater poverty in any society. So let me talk about the brief history of anti-poverty policy in the UK. The UK has a very long history of anti-poverty policies, and the first important policies were really the Charter of the Forest, which was introduced in 1217. It was the companion charter to Magna Carta. Magna Carta was about the rights of the nobility. The Charter of the Forest was about the rights of the ordinary people. And it introduced such concepts as the Commonwealth and the Commons. And the Charter guaranteed the rights of free men and widows to use the raw forest, which covered most of the land area of England and Wales at the time, to basically sustain themselves, to gather berries and herbs, to graze their animals, to collect wood, to build homes and fires and make tools for grazing, to collect honey, to dig ponds to put fish in, and therefore provided the basic means for people to subsist. This was very long-lasting legislation that was only repealed in the 1970s. And it forms the basis of many other constitutional documents around the world, including the US Constitution. Although when the 800th anniversary came up, the government really didn't want to celebrate this charter. There's still people who seem to think it was not a good idea. It's 800 years later. The idea that poverty could be eradicated is relatively new by contrast, and it comes from the revolutionary thought surrounding the foundation of the revolution in France and the formation of the French Republic in the 18th century. And the argument was, in a book published posthumously, that poverty was not the result of divine will, an act of God or nature, but due to present imperfections of the social arts. And it was argued that poverty could be ended through the provision of pensions, grants to the young, sickness benefits, and state education, what we think of today as welfare state solutions. Of course, in the 18th century, these ideas were thought of as crazy, but today, most governments in the world, particularly those who've signed up the Sustainable Development Goals, think this is the way that poverty can be reduced and eradicated. So, if the UK has had anti-poverty policies for hundreds of years, why hasn't a very rich society like the UK managed to eradicate poverty? Well, the main problem has been that for most of that time, the purpose of the anti-poverty policy has not been to eradicate poverty, but to do other things. So in the 17th and 18th century, it was the relief of indigence. In the 19th and 20th century, it's relief of destitution. In the 20th century, it was the alleviation of poverty. And only in the 21st century has it been the eradication of poverty. So, sorry. Go back. I'll explain those terms. In the 17th and 18th century, poverty was thought of as a necessity. Without the threat of poverty, people would not work. They would just stay at home, they would do nothing, and civilization would come to an end. Therefore, poverty was a regrettable necessity needed to make people work. And if you eradicated poverty, it would be literally the end of your society. So the purpose of anti-poverty policy was to prevent starvation, not to eradicate poverty. And there was the introduction of what was called the Old Poor Law in 1599, which formed a basic social security network. And this had the unintended consequence of freeing peasants up from their attachment to the land so they could move to the emerging towns, because they knew that if things did not work out and they could not raise their income, they would not starve. And then when the technology for the Industrial Revolution came along, the UK was able to benefit because it already had an urban workforce, whereas much richer and more sophisticated societies like France and the Netherlands at the time didn't have that urban workforce. And so the Industrial Revolution happened in the UK first, and then spread around the world because of this early social security system. However, this social security system cost about 2% of GDP at the time. It was considered expensive, and therefore the rich who were taxed in order to pay for it didn't like it. And the new poor law was introduced in the 19th century on the idea that poverty was caused by the bad behavior of the poor. And therefore, the purpose of anti-poverty policy was to make life so terrible for the poor that they would change their wicked ways and see that they should go and get a job, and poverty would then end. It's only in the 20th century when these policies were proven to be completely ineffective after being pursued for 100 years that the welfare state was invented, and it was designed to alleviate poverty. And only in the 21st century, it's really been aimed to eradicate poverty. So there were many academic studies in the 19th and 20th century, often by highly partisan observers like Charles Booth, which aimed to show that poverty was caused by the bad behavior of the poor. Drunkenness, fecklessness, loafing, alcoholism. To their surprise, what they found is the majority of poverty was not due to the bad behavior of the poor, but due to structural causes: unemployment, low wages, ill health. And to this day, they are the main causes of poverty. And the problem is anti-poverty policies aimed at changing the bad behaviors of the poor are likely to be ineffective because that is not the primary cause of poverty and never has been. So if you go back to the 1960s, during the 1960s and 70s, if you look at the number of children living in relatively low-income households, this is below 60% of median income, it was around 15%. In the end of the 1970s, a Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher was elected, and that pursued very different anti-poverty policies, and child poverty effectively doubled. The Labour government was elected in 1997 and started to try to tackle poverty, child poverty, and was beginning to work towards eradicating it. But after the financial crash, child poverty has again risen to about twice the rate it was in the 1960s and 70s, using these relative income measures. Those attempts to eradicate child poverty at the beginning of this century were proving to be very effective. There were 4 target measures of poverty eradication, of which the most reliable is the combined low income and deprivation one, which Professor Abe showed you some of the indicators of. And by about 2010, the government was more or less on target to what they determined was the eradication of child poverty, which was not to eradicate it completely, but to get down to Nordic levels, to the kind of levels that you find in Norway and Sweden. Those effective anti-poverty policies were increasing spending on welfare benefits, a minimum wage, labour market activation to increase employment, increase spending on health and education, early childhood programs such as Sure Start and some area-based policies. These were very effective policies. They worked for 10 years. They would work if reintroduced today. Unfortunately, after the financial crash and the change of government, very different welfare policies were pursued, which, if they had been continued until this current year, would have led to a significant reduction in the incomes of the poorest 20% of the population, but little change in the incomes of the richest 30% of the population, so a 10% fall. So the UN assessed the UK's anti-poverty policies and achievements in 2019 and wrote a very strong report. It said that although the UK is the 5th largest economy in the world, 1/5 of the population live in poverty, 1.5 million people will experience destitution. Austerity policies introduced in 2010 continued unabated. Despite the tragic social consequences, 40% of children were predicted to be living in poverty by 2021. Food banks have grown, rough sleeping has increased. Thousands of poor families live in accommodation far from schools, jobs, communities. Life expectancy was falling for certain age groups, and access to justice had been declining. The UN concluded that the bottom line is that much of the glue that has held British society together since the Second World War has been deliberately removed and replaced with a harsh and uncaring ethos. A booming economy, high employment, and a budget surplus had not reversed these austerity policies, and these policies were pursued for ideological reasons rather than because of economic needs. Government ministers, of course, disagreed with the UN's assessment, but when Parliament asked the senior civil servants in the Department for Work and Pensions, responsible for anti-poverty policies, what they thought of the UN report, they said that the report made a lot of good points. It was factually correct in terms of the facts, in terms of austerity and cuts to local government funding, in terms of reliance on the labour market and the risk if there's a recession. All were good points made by the United Nations, which we need to take on board. That was before the pandemic. So what has the pandemic done? Well, the death rates from the pandemic have differentially impacted the poor. Those living in the poorest areas in all the 4 countries of the UK have seen twice the death rates of those living in the richer areas. It's not just in terms of mortality and morbidity the pandemic has impacted on the UK. It has also led to an impoverishment of a large part of the population. The Financial Impact Tracker survey found that 1/3 of households reported a fall in income, and that 10% of households were in serious financial difficulties, and a further 16% were struggling to make ends meet. The Food Foundation survey found that almost 5 million adults are food insecure, compared with 2 million before the lockdown. And that 11% of children last summer reported that their families had to visit a food bank in the summer holidays so they could have enough food. The Resolution Foundation found that 33% of employees in the bottom 20% of weekly earnings had experienced job loss or were put on furlough, compared with only 15% of those in the top income quintile. The pandemic has led to significant reductions in the incomes, according to self-reports, of about 1/5 of adults in the UK. It's not just in, say, the poor parts of London in the east, but also in some of the richer parts of London and parts of the richer parts of the southeast. So it's impacted both rich and poor, but impacted the poor the worst. So between March and October 2020, according to the Financial Conduct Authority, 3.5 million people were entered into low financial resilience. About 27% of the population, according to the UK government, are now suffering from low financial resilience. And this is impacted most on families with children and children themselves. So 4 million children, this is using the latest data from March 2021, 4 million children live in families that have lost income. 3 million children live in families who now find it a constant struggle to buy food and necessities. This is a much greater problem for families with children compared to those without children. Also, what the UK has experienced is a loss of population. There was a large immigrant population, particularly from Europe, working in the UK, particularly in London, during before the pandemic, and it's estimated that 1.3 million people have left and gone back to their own countries since a year ago when the first lockdown occurred. So the UK is faced with having to rebuild after the pandemic has been eradicated with a smaller workforce. I'll just very quickly run through some of the key messages from research about what needs to be done to rebuild after the pandemic. So the first message from research is that poverty is not a behavior. The primary cause of poverty is structural factors such as low wages, lack of adequate number of hours for people working, poor jobs, not necessarily a lack of jobs, and low benefit levels. The same in the UK and Japan. Poverty is often concentrated, particularly child poverty, amongst working poor households where someone is in work. Poverty is also not a disease. You cannot catch poverty. You can't pass it to your parents. You can't give it to your friends. There is no culture of poverty. It's not parents teaching their children to be poor. The UK government is often worried about cultures of worklessness and multiple generations where families have not worked, but academic studies have failed to find a single household where there's been 3 generations of worklessness, and virtually no households where there's been 2 generations of worklessness. These are the stuff of anecdotes, not scientific research. Lastly, the economics of poverty is very complex, but the economics of child poverty is very simple, and it's entirely to do with redistribution. Where sufficient resources are redistributed from adults to children, there is no child poverty. Where insufficient resources go from adults to children, then child poverty is inevitable. Children should not be doing paid work. They should not be generating their own resources to escape from poverty. That is the job of adults. Children should be playing with their friends and going to school and learning. Adults need to provide for children, their parents, and if their parents can't provide, then that is the job of the community and the state. So to conclude, the COVID pandemic may increase inequality and relative poverty to levels not seen since before the welfare state was introduced. Poor people are being hospitalized and dying of COVID-19 infections at twice the rate of rich people after adjusting for age and gender. At present, the UK government has no policies which attempt to reduce these inequalities in severe COVID infections and death rates. The present UK government has no post-furlough, post-pandemic policies designed to reduce the likely impact, increasing poverty and inequality, which we think will happen. On the positive side, the COVID-19 vaccination program in the UK is going very well, and the furlough scheme and the 20% temporary increase in social assistance in universal credit has alleviated the worst economic effects of the pandemic. So The future is there to be won, but at the moment, things are not looking good, but I am still optimistic. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to wrap it up there because it's 1:15 now. But thank you so much to both of you, both of our speakers, for wonderful presentations and really clearing away some of the mist and around all of this subject. And certainly in Japan, we learned a lot of new things, I think, because it's not widely known that there is significant poverty in Japan. But for today, thank you to the speakers and thank you all for joining us.